Welcome to today's webinar on training for results. What we're hoping to do today, to give you a little bit of a preview before we get into it, is to share some ideas that we at Kineo have been working on over the past year on an age-old problem in the learning space. How can we ensure that our investments in learning actually pay dividends to the business, that more than pay back their costs, that produce a positive result for the business. And we'll share some ideas that we've been working on over the past year that take a fresh look at the problem. To preview that, there'll be one idea about what constitutes a kind of learner journey that we would like to provide. One idea about how can we make blends that matter, making sure that we include the ingredients that do have an impact on a solution and don't throw extra things in that complicate the solution without having an impact. And then a third idea finally on how can we make sure that when we're investing in the learning solution that we really focus on what matters in terms of what content should go into that solution. So three ideas that all come from a shared background that we'll talk about as we get into the session today. Just wanted to say thanks for joining. In terms of just logistics for the session today, please enter questions, comments in the chat window as we go along. We'll set aside a few minutes at the end to cover those, but also we'll try to cover some of them as we go through the session today. In terms of just to introduce myself, whoops, let me back up. I'm Chip Cleary. I'm with Kineo in the US. I'm our Vice President for Design, Solutions, and Consulting. Also with me to help lead the session today are Amber Hodges, our organizer, so she'll be helping with the chat window, and Cami Bean's available as well. So thanks again for joining. As we dig in, let me set the stage a little bit. When I talk to my kids about being in the learning space, one of the things I like to say to them is just it's really a great time to be a learning professional. You can't go through a week without reading in the newspaper how the pace of change is accelerating, how people need to learn new skills more than they ever have, how people stay in jobs for a shorter period of time than ever have, and even if they stay in the same job, how the processes that they operate change rapidly over time. So there's a huge demand for people who really focus on helping others develop new skills. Great news. At the same time, you also can't be in the learning space without getting an email a day about some new potential method that you can use to train learners. So we have a wealth of new technology, we have a wealth of new ideas, we have a large business need in the world for what we do. So it's just a great time to be in learning. At the same point, there's a series of stubborn numbers that seem to persist year after year. And we've chosen an example of them to share on the slide here. That say, many of our business leaders just aren't as wowed with the value that they see us providing to them as we would like them to be. That we have some opportunities to do better what we're working on when we're trying to help the businesses we're with. So the examples here: 25% of CEOs say that their training programs are effective at measurably improving performance from McKinsey. Again, 25%, 24% feel that their organization's training is tightly linked to their strategy. Everyone wants to be able to have declared results on training. Less than 10% feel that they do now. Clearly, while the demand is high and while our arrows, the breadth of our toolkit is growing, we have some room for improvement on how we help our businesses. And just as I get into today, what I'd like to do is just start out with a quick question. Those numbers are clearly broad-based numbers. To get a feel for who's in the audience today, I'd like to start out with a poll. And this is, if you think about the people who requisition and pay for learning solutions, depending on your model, inside your organization, how do they view learning and development? Do they view you as a trusted advisor who's a business thinker? Your learning organization is a trusted advisor, business thinker, who happens to specialize in a function where you add value? Do they view you as a valued service provider? Well, you're in the learning space, but they know when they come to you that you'll understand the problem and you do a great job. Are you a second thought, training who? Oh yeah, we have a group like that. I guess it's time that we pull them in for this one. Do they view you as being disconnected to the business? Or do they view you as just being downright unhelpful, and frankly, they'd rather go somewhere else to try to solve their problems? So Amber, let me ask you to open up the poll and let people respond to this question. We'll give you about half a minute to be able to respond to this question. Inside your organization, clearly there'll be different views, but what's the most common view that you think that the business takes towards you? The numbers are coming in now. Give it about another 15 seconds. Okay. Another 5 seconds. Okay, and then Amber, why don't we close out the poll and share the results back? Great. So, the results are actually really promising for this group. So kudos, pat yourself on the back. 50%, so by far the largest number, valued service provider, which frankly from the conversations I've had with business leaders over the years, a higher ratio than I tend to hear from business leaders. 10% in the trusted advisor role, so clearly while more of us would like to move there, that's not a bad number. It's at the same point, you know, even here a fair amount of training who are disconnected, so not connected with the business. And you know, part of what we'll talk about today are some thoughts about how can we work on our solutions in a way that will help business leaders both understand how to work with us, but also see the value. I'll make sure that we provide value and make sure that that value is clear to the business leaders who are funding the bills at the end of the day and who are the reason why we're in the business in the first place. So jumping ahead at this point, what I'll share is if you ask the question, why is it that with such a demand for what we do and such a wealth of resources at our disposal for doing it, we don't have the numbers and the reception with business sponsors that we might hope to have in many cases. Why is that? That's clearly a very complicated question. And what we're going to talk about in the next few minutes is one key answer to that question. A complicated question, there's clearly other questions, but one key answer that we found over the past while has led to some really interesting trains of thought on how we can better serve business sponsors. So the question here is, do you find sometimes this happens in your organization? There'll be a need. The Learning and Development Group will work really hard to provide some great training. We'll struggle to make sure we can get it out of the door in the sometimes relatively limited time frame we have. We'll try to make sure it's an engaging experience that changes behavior to the extent that we possibly can make it do so. We may wrap up with some calls to action of things that we hope our participants will take back to the field. And so then we provide that training experience, and then we hope that it has an outcome in the field and that it supported the business outcome that led the business to charter it in the first place. You know, when we hope that, you know, sometimes that hope comes with a whole number of caveats because we recognize there's many slips that can come between cup and lip as we put a learning solution out into the field. It can be that we sometimes select the wrong audience to put into it, so people who actually don't need the skills. It can be we have target audience members who don't believe that they need it, even if they do. It can be that people go back into the job and their manager tells them something else. That's not how we do it. And they undermine the learning experience we just provided. It can be that we had subject matter expertise that didn't actually reflect what the real world was, and we provided an artificial view of the world. Lots of different reasons, but what we've seen in many situations is perhaps, you know, the most common thing that we do as professionals in learning development is that we work really, really hard to provide the most impactful possible learning experience and training experience we can provide. We put it out in the field, and then we find ourselves in a position where we're hoping that we get the result. And when we step back from that, the question that comes is, well, does this mean that we're managing an activity instead of managing the result? We're really focused on managing the training activity instead of trying to strive for the business result. And the ideas that we're going to talk about for a minute come from asking the question, what change would happen if we said, boy, whatever program we put into the field, let's design it so that we will have demonstrated results at the end of the program. And we will take accountability, not necessarily for providing a hard ROI number, because there's lots of contingencies that go into that. But if a training program is to provide a skill that our participants actually demonstrate that skill in the wild, on the job, before we wrap up that program. And so we've asked ourselves the question over the past year, what shift in perspective, what change would it make to our solutions if we in fact took the perspective of managing for results as opposed to managing for activities? And that's what we'll share in the next few minutes with you. What we've come up with is 3 major shifts in perspective, 3 major steps to take that come when you adopt that perspective. So the first has to do with designing a journey. And I'll describe that first. I'll describe in a little bit more detail what we mean by that, but it means by providing a longer experience with more steps in it that have different functions than necessarily just managing the learning step that we traditionally take ownership over. Journeys can be complicated. In order to be able to implement them pragmatically with budget constraints and time constraints, we need to find a way to deliver them efficiently, and we'll share some thoughts on that. And then finally, what we found is that as we begin to take ownership over results, it makes us shine a sharper focus than ever on the needs assessment step up front and how we focus on what really matters to the business so that we have a clear contract that we can work on with our business leaders about what to improve, and we can also judge for ourselves better whether we're reaching that target or not. So those are the 3 concepts, 3 key steps that we're going to dig into. Let's go ahead and get started on the first one, designing journeys. Let's start out with an example. So imagine that you're in an organization, and many of us here said that we're treated as valued service providers. As a valued service provider, one thing that will happen is on Monday morning you may get a call. And that call will say, hey, we have a business issue. We'd like to have your help come in to sort out what the performance issues are behind it. And so you get the opportunity to do performance consulting. Something often that if your business leaders don't think that well of you, you don't get the opportunity to do up front. In this case, imagine that, yep, management wants to improve quality for maybe a particular group that you're working with. You've done the performance consulting. What you realized is a key driver for why teams aren't providing quality outputs is that the supervisors, the frontline leaders in those teams, aren't setting expectations very effectively. And so in order to improve quality, a key step to take is to make sure that frontline leaders set expectations more effectively. Okay, great. So now that you've done that, imagine in your back of your head for a minute, what's the kind of solution you might imagine that you would provide in order to help those team leaders set expectations more effectively? And we can compare that as we go forward to what we'll put on a table in a minute. So what happens next? As we've taken the perspective of shifting from trying to provide a great learning experience to taking accountability for, in this case, making sure frontline leaders can set expectations effectively on the job, we found ourselves going through a number of transitions. This slide summarizes them. And in fact, to give you a little bit of a preview, we're going to share some examples in just a couple of minutes from a product that we'll be bringing out in January, which is based on just this thinking. So you today are getting a little bit of a preview to a product called Management Plus that Kineo will be introducing for frontline management skills. And you get a little insight into some of the thinking that went behind that product. So in terms of the shifts in our perspective, we're shifting from, we'll train you, we'll provide a learning experience, to you, Mr. Participant, will demonstrate proficiency before we're done. And that means that in order for us to be able to carry that out, we need a way to see whether or not you're doing it. And that moves from oftentimes what we'll do at the end of a training course is we'll provide some kind of quiz as our assessment to actually you'll have to perform in the field. In order to do that, what we find ourselves doing is often turning to who's best to rate that performance and realizing it's the manager of a participant who's the best person to rate performance. So from quizzing to you and your manager will rate your performance in the wild. We'll shift from our training being the key intervention that will give you the skills you need to really viewing the training as a step in the journey, and really in particular a step that prepares you to go out and practice in the field, and the practice in the field being a real critical step. We'll shift from we've given you a call to action and we hope that you use the new skills on the job to deliberate practice of the skill in the field is the heart of the solution, and that's really where the change happens, where the change makes place. And we will integrate that as a step in our solution where we're no longer hoping that you'll do it, but we're actually making a tracked, structured part of the solution we'll offer you. And when we do that, we're beginning to put accountability on the backs of participants and on their managers, and that means we're shifting from we, the trainers, are in charge. We've scheduled you. We've made sure you showed up. We've brought great facilitators to you. We've created the experience. We're the ones in charge. To really, you, the participant, and your manager are the ones who are in charge and accountable for getting the results. We, in learning and development, have created the tools that you need in order for you to succeed as you do that. And then finally, the final transition is, oftentimes we're not that clear on what happens in the training. And here, what we're talking to is let's shift to a structured system where step by step we see the results that build up. The whole process runs on documented results of how the behaviors are taking place. So that's an overview of the perspective. What the phrase we use to summarize that is something called proficiency journeys, learning solutions that lead to demonstrated results. And to get a feel for what that might feel like, imagine now that you yourself are a new frontline supervisor. And you are a self-driven learner, so you're not waiting for the folks in learning and development to give you a solution. And you realize that you perhaps aren't as strong in setting expectations as you should be. What's the kind of path you might follow in order to be able to build your own skills? Our thinking is that that path is actually predictable with predictable steps. If we can understand that path, we can not only support the self-directed learner, we can recreate that path for all learners, so we can drive people through it. And that path might look like something like this. If you're somebody who realizes that you're struggling with setting expectations, well, you're already engaged. What you might do is you might step back and first try to ask your team members, boy, how do they feel you are at setting expectations? Where is it that you're strong? What kind of issues do they run into when they try to follow through on the expectations that you're setting? From that, you might do some diagnosis and realize that you're actually pretty good at taking moments for when you set expectations, for example, but you just don't have a very clear model for what expectations you should set. So given your diagnosis, you might do some targeted learning. And in this case, if your question is, boy, what's really a great model for expectations, you might run across the SMART model, specific, measurable, accurate, and so on. With that model, that gives you a model that you can then apply back in the field for trying to give better expectations. And so you might go for the next 2 or 3 weeks, and every time you set expectations, you might try to actually literally use SMART to be able to apply your expectations. After a few weeks of doing that, you might step back and assess, have you reached? Did you get the change that you were hoping to change? And you might realize that, in fact, you've improved, but on reflection, one thing SMART doesn't give you is it doesn't really actually have you set expectations about how to monitor progress as you go ahead. There's a piece missing. So you might decide to add another piece to your solution and then go back. You will have learned a little more, apply until when you assess, you say that you've reached. Now that journey that you've gone through, engage, diagnose, learn, apply, assess, what we propose is that that journey is a pretty reliable path for people to go through when they're learning new behaviors and skills in almost every case. Now clearly, specifics will vary according to the problem you're solving, but that's a repeatable journey. And if a self-directed learner can follow that journey, well, why can't we take a journey like that, and why can't we turn it into a structured experience that even people who perhaps aren't as self-directed can go through to get the same benefit at the end? So to give you an example of what that might look like, let's give you a little bit of a snapshot under the hood of Management Plus, which is coming out, which is something we can show you to elucidate the ideas. So imagine we have 2 characters. We have Frank, who's a frontline manager. He has perhaps 6 weeks in the role. And what that means about Frank is that he's a little bit under the weeds. He's kind of overwhelmed. He's got a lot of skills he needs to learn. He's new on the job. He may be a little bit intimidated by the role. And Frank reports to Julia, district manager, who's got perhaps a couple of years experience. So, we're now in a company where we've decided that not only Frank, but the other frontline managers need to set expectations better. How might we be able to structure that process? Well, the first step of the process is engage. And, whereas in our self-directed example, we realized that, we said our person realized for themselves that they needed help. Well, we might need to have Frank have a little bit of a prompt to realize he needs help. So we might give him an activity to do that. And you know, this activity here has him reflect on his own experience. So he can go out and think about others who have supervised him and what's worked well and what hasn't worked well in setting expectations. And so Frank might use that as a prompt to begin to think of his own experience. And you know, inside the solution that we're trying to develop here, the approach is we're really trying to form this partnership between Frank and Julia. So one thing we might have Frank do is to make sure that when he's done one of these reflections, he's beginning to think for himself, where will he want to focus his effort as he tries to improve his skills in building expectations. And he'll need to get some insights for that. So this reflection may give him some insights. And what we'll ask him to do is not tell us all of the details of what he learned, but share with Julia some of the key insights that he learned from this. You know, so Frank may realize that, in fact, he's actually never had a good role model for how to set expectations. And so he might share that back. That will identify for him, start to engage him in the process, realize that he needs to have some improvement. And so part of the experience here is part of our structuring this is providing the technology support that allows Frank and Julia to be able to communicate with each other readily as they go through this journey. So step one, engage. You know, after having done this activity, Frank, it's not like we're telling Frank he needs to learn at this point. We're giving Frank the opportunity to discover that he needs to learn, and more than that, specifically what he needs to learn about setting expectations. In Diagnose, we deepen that. So one technique in Diagnose, the one that we use in Management Plus, is to be able to provide a bit of a Cosmo quiz that breaks down what are the behaviors that when you set expectations effectively, you find yourself performing. And again, let you self-rate on them. How do you feel that you do? When do you set expectations? When you set expectations, do you follow the series of best practices? And again, Frank will go through this exercise, and he'll get to see the results. Where is he in the green? Where is he, you know, doing okay in the blue? Where does he have a little bit of a worry in the orange? And where does he really, where is he falling off the shelf in the red? And this is a way, again, for us to say, not to Frank, you need to learn to set expectations because we, the training organization, told you, but rather to allow Frank to discover his need to set expectations. And one thing that's nice about this is if, in fact, Frank realizes that he agrees with his manager that he is proficient in setting expectations already, well, we can short-circuit the journey. We don't need to spend our time or Frank's having him try to hone a skill that he already has. We can move ahead. On the other hand, if Frank isn't in that case, which will be the case for many frontline managers, he now has a series of targets, fairly specific. Not only does he want to grow in setting expectations, but in this case, Frank wants to make sure that he can provide more measurable expectations. He wants to make sure he can ensure accountability, and he wants to make sure that he can set expectations in all the cases that he should set expectations. So we haven't even started the training at this point, and yet, you know, we have at this point now a participant who we don't have to convince, who has convinced himself of the need to learn. So we've been an engaged participant. So that's a good moment to go ahead with learning. I won't say a whole lot about the learning step. That's where we tend to spend most of our time. We have lots of techniques for it. This happens to be a self-study technique using e-learning, scenario-based e-learning approach. You know, but this is where we tend to focus our effort. Now, the benefit we have at this point is that we have Frank walking into this, knowing fairly specifically where his particular gaps are, and knowing furthermore that when he comes out of it, he's going to need to practice these skills in the field. So, you know, our experience is that by doing the setup with engage and diagnose, and then making sure that it's clearly understood that apply practice in the field is coming next, that we have pretty attentive learners who really are motivated, who are driven to be able to build the skills that they require to be successful with their teams. So that's the learn step. After that, apply. And, you know, most training programs, at least many training programs, do have a call to action at the end where we ask people to go back to apply. You know, the difference here is that we're making it really a structured step that's integrated into the program, which we track. And so the particular way we do that in Management Plus is for each skill covered, we ask the participant usually to go out to 3 team members pick them, try an example of the skill with each. When we say try an example, we give a little format like illustrated here that leads you through the process of preparing for that interaction. You can use that then when you conduct the interaction. And then we close the loop by having you reflect on what happened in the interaction and what did we learn. And those insights, again, are entered into the technology platform, which means that they're communicated to Julia, the manager. So now Frank is applying, he's reflecting, so it's deliberate practice where he reflects on what happens, and he shares it back with his manager. So this is a step of making sure that the skills and learning don't simply fall off the end of the pier when Frank goes back to the job, but rather really get used on the job and get communicated back. So we have both accountability and reflection in for learning. That's the apply step. And then this is an example of what that documenting step might look like. In fact, does look like. We asked Frank to identify for each of the practices that he does with setting expectations, to say what set of expectations did you set, what worked well and what could you improve, what insights do you have based on that. Again, only a couple sentences, but it makes sure that we have that cycle of reflective practice working, and that gets communicated between Frank and his manager. So as they talk about Frank's progress, they have grist for the mill based on Frank's actual experience. And then finally, the final step, assess. We have Frank go back and assess his capability to be able to apply the skill in the field. While there's lots of opportunities for how we can do assess, we use a relatively straightforward approach in Management Plus, and that leads to a conversation. So Frank and his manager, Julia, are now being held accountable for, is Frank getting the results from his ability to set expectations in the field that they desire based on the work that they've done? And that's based on, and that leads to first the assessment and then a conversation between Frank and his manager. In order to support that conversation, what we found is that many organizations would like to better engage managers or participants in the learning experience, and they're often afraid to do that because they're afraid managers may not be strong in the skills being taught in the first place, and they're afraid that managers may not have the follow-through or the structure in order to be able to coach their participants. And so by including these steps as integral parts of the journey and by providing just a little bit of performance support, you can see in the background on the screen an agenda with some key questions a manager might ask of a participant going into a check-in conversation. That we're able to get a lot of the benefit of deep manager involvement by just carving off kind of the minimum viable set of activities that we'd really like that manager to do. And in fact, in our work in the field on this, what we found is that by starting the ball rolling in that, we get really high levels of compliance. So an area that you think might be risky turns out to be pragmatic once you structure it and track it. The old you manage what you measure adage. But what we also find as a benefit for that is once we get the conversation started on the right foot using tools like these, quite a number of managers and participants carry on that conversation quite a bit past the few steps that we asked for in the structured program. So that's the assess step. So stepping back from that, the first big idea that we've come to in terms of training for results was providing the proficiency journey that follows the steps of engage, diagnose, learn, apply, and assess. Okay. Oops. Now, that's the core idea behind the journey. One thing I'll just raise as a caveat is that as we've shared these ideas, a number of people have said to us, sounds interesting, but also sounds complicated. Do you always have to have such a complicated approach to every learning problem? And the short answer to that is no, the solution should meet the problem. We've really focused this approach on cases where we're trying to change behavior in the field, and the more complicated that behavior changes and the more resistant that participants will be to it, the more, I guess I'd say unmotivated perhaps would be a better word. The more oomph that we need to put behind making sure that we follow the full set of the processes. But just to give you an example of how this same approach can work for a different shape of a problem, here's one that has to do with an area in compliance training. So, imagine that now management has a different goal. We're trying to improve information security. Again, you've done the performance consulting work, and you realize that actually there's only a relatively small set of relatively simple common risks that the organization needs to tackle, and some simple steps will tackle them effectively. Things like change your password every 2 months. Don't use USB sticks that you picked up from the parking lot. Challenge is, well, so how would you tackle a problem like this? And, if you think about those steps, engage, diagnose, learn, apply, assess, actually, this is a pretty simple problem. There's not a lot to be learned. There's not a lot of self-diagnosis that needs to happen. It's not difficult to tell whether you're following the steps or not. The real problem is it's hard to get somebody's attention to even listen in the first place. So this is an area where it's very easy to come across as saying, we have some information we want to convey and we're going to take some of your time, and hard to really get bandwidth with the target audience. So in a case like that, that leads to not necessarily putting the same oomph behind every leg of the journey, but a different kind of solution. And the solution in this case for us was really to create a campaign based on fun, information-grabbing storytelling. And in particular, this had to do with telling a story about a fictitious group, a couple of people, Barclay and Fisk, who were out there trying to improve the world as superheroes of security management, information security, and caught in story after story about snafu, kind of friendly, lovable guys about where they run into problems in the real world trying to make this happen. And the campaign was fun. It was organized around a series of vignettes delivered in movies, but also had lots of other kind of fun tips. So it became almost like an immersive advertising campaign. Intranet site, there were pop-up tents at lunchrooms, there were posters, flyers, there's a contest associated with it. So it was really, let's not deliver you a course as a learning experience. It was, let's touch you a series of times with something that's kind of fun, tongue-in-cheek, interesting, and the reason for that is because the real challenge behind this solution was engage. So just a quick example showing that that process is useful to think through when you're doing. However, you put a different level of oomph behind the steps depending on the shape of your problem. This particular campaign, without the real heavy formal training, still said 86% increased their awareness, and 37% reported that it changed the way they work, without a whole lot of emphasis on actually follow up with that part. So again, a different application of engage, diagnose, learn, apply, and assess. So that's the first concept. The second one is, if we are going to try to build these learning journeys in which we embed the manager, in which we embed performance, we take deliberate practice as a structured part, that sounds almost like what we're really doing is trying to give a mentored apprenticeship. And that sounds like there's a lot of people time required to do that. Well, in the practical world, we can't invest that kind of people time in our solutions. So how can we deliver it efficiently? And that really comes down to a blended solution. One thing that falls out nicely from the approach that we're talking about, we found, is an approach to trying to figure out what should go into that blended solution. Because as a designer, when you're faced with all of the options that we have in today's world, should I provide performance support? What kind of social support should I provide? Is there a chat room? Is there a forum? Are there check-ins? The world is full of options for interventions we can choose to put into our learning programs. The question is really, which one should we? And the answer that we come to that, it becomes quite structured and needs-based, based on taking this approach. Again, this chart lays out that process: engage, diagnose, learn, apply, assess. And for each of these, there are some common tactics we might use to be able to carry out that function. What we found as we've been applying this over the past year in the field is it becomes pretty straightforward to start out with the need first. How big a need do we have to engage this group? What's the shape of that need? Do they understand the importance of the content? Do they understand their own skill level? Do they understand the impact it has on the business? Do they understand some of the techniques that it means, what the difference is between doing it well and what's not doing it well? When you ask some questions about what's the need to engage, after answering those questions, it pops out pretty quickly. Well, what's the right solution element? Based on the specifics of needs that we have to engage here in their size and their shape, what solutions should we consider? And the same for the other ones, diagnose. When we look at what is the need to have people diagnose, should we give a self-assessment? Should we give a 360 assessment? Can it be a quick Cosmo quiz? Do we need something more intensive to do that? Again, when we learn, how big a learning need do we have for this? How many steps should we go in? Which sort of interaction should we take into account? Really, what comes out of this model, by going through engage, diagnose, learn, apply, assess, is the notion that we can pare down what we want in our blended solution by thinking quite specifically about the shape of the problem using this model. And that gives us a really nice way to be able to say, we have a blended solution, but it's not a blended solution that has bolt-on components of blends. It's a blended solution where everything's nicely integrated because it's all driven around the journey that we're trying to take people through along with their managers. And that simply means asking the questions in the right order. What's the gap for each leg of the journey? What we found is really useful as we're doing that design work is to take the next step as a blue sky step, to say, if we didn't have cost and practicality as an obstacle, what's the perfect experience we might want to do? So for example, in the information security case that we just talked about, well, if your identity was just stolen by somebody, you might all of a sudden feel that information security is a bigger need tomorrow than you felt yesterday. So what I'm thinking here is if we can give people a concrete experience of having their security violated, that might be the best thing. Well, we can't really do that, but what we can do is we can tell stories. So we can dramatize what it means to have security violations happen and the impact that they have. And then that led to that idea of the movies and the campaign around that. So that means that as we're thinking about blended learning, we're moving from thinking first about the component, the techniques we might use, should we have social as part of the solution, and instead we're starting top down from the shape of the need that we have to the solutions that we'll put in place. So that's the second key plank. First, design a journey that includes proficiency on the job as part of it. Second, use an appropriate blend to pare down what's really important about getting that journey into shape and be able to focus on that part using the right blended components. And the third part is focusing on what matters. And really this is about a form of needs assessment, which is the more concrete we can be about what behaviors mean success, the easier our problem is, the easier it is, the more concrete we can be with our learners, the better chance we'll have for success. And the way we think about that is there's often an issue with building training courses. That in many cases, the way we do that is we start out by asking the experts, what do those frontline managers need to know about setting expectations? And the issue with that is that subject matter experts are very willing to share the wealth of their expertise. So when you ask a subject matter expert, what does this person need to know about your area, you almost inevitably get back, starts out as a long list and then only grows as you have a longer conversation. And that's natural because subject matter experts are obviously passionate about what they do. They're proud of what they've learned, and they often think that it's important that people have most of what they learn. And quite importantly, one part about being an expert is that you simply forget what it's like to be a novice. As you build the mental structures required to see the world, see the domain through the eyes of an expert, you forget what it is to have those mental structures and simply be confused. And so as a subject matter expert, it's actually quite easy to miss what's important from the novice's perspective, even while you're layering nuance, which from your perspective becomes quite important. And what we've looked at is we've looked at a different way to try to tackle that problem. So not necessarily from what does a subject matter expert say is important, but trying to understand what happens in the field as people have behavior issues. And the way we think about that is really trying to do some simple math, which is if somebody makes a particular mistake in the field, Well, how important is making that mistake to a business result? So, for example, if I am selling cosmetics in a retail store and I fail to greet the customer, how important is that to the result of me making a sale? And compare that mistake to fail to offer alternatives at different price points for the thing that you're selling. How important is that mistake towards being able to close the sale? So one is, how important is a behavior to business results? The second factor is, how often, how big is the performance gap around that behavior? Do most salespeople actually offer products at different price points, or do most salespeople not do that? So the larger the size of the performance gap, the larger the value of training. And then finally, to what extent can we, through a learning solution, actually remediate the performance gap? So if the reason for the gap is because the manager tells the person to do something else, it doesn't matter how good our learning solution is going to be. We'll lose against the force of the manager. Or if the reason for the gap is that the manager doesn't want you to spend your time this way, but they want you to spend your time another way, again, we'll lose against that. So we can't remediate every performance gap through a learning solution. And what we found is that by applying this kind of math to the specific behaviors that are at play in a particular domain, what jumps out is that some are radically more important to the business than others. Some we can have a much bigger impact on than the others. So let me share a relatively complicated graph to kind of illustrate that. This graph is from an example in the world of textbook sales. And what is down the vertical column are the steps in one organization's textbook sales process. You start out the year, you do territory planning. Every day you do daily planning. When you try to implement something, you do pilot testing for it. You do something called client inventory support. You implement your solutions, and you troubleshoot problems when they arise. And in this case, what the client found was that there are somewhere between 5 and 8 specific decisions that a sales rep makes in each of these areas. So that's the total length of the bars here are, what are the number of decisions that you make? So territory planning, there's 7 decisions. Pilot testing, there's 5 decisions. Now, what we did with this group is we went through and we analyzed, we performed that math for each of those decisions. How much of an impact would we have if we were to implement a learning solution focused on one decision versus another decision? And the color coding here represents the results of that. So if you look at the light green, that's where we found that those decisions were ones that if we invested in learning, we'd have the highest business impact. And the darker green says, well, we'd have a middling impact there, and the gray is really a low impact. So for example, in territory planning, where there's lots of decisions that they're made there, it turns out that, in fact, when we dug under the covers, most of those decisions are made pretty well, and the ones that aren't made as well aren't that important to the business. So not a very high impact. On the other hand, this step of pilot testing, which was interesting to our client, jumped out as being an area where there was all sorts of impact to be made. That 4 out of 5 decisions were high impact decisions. The other one was a medium impact decision. And those were areas where reps were not doing that well at it, but it mattered a bunch to the business, and there were things that we could actually build their skills and see results on. So clearly, having a heat map like this allows us to focus our solution much more tightly, so that when we're working with our business sponsors to say, what do we want to do with this solution? Based on a heat map like this, well, we really want to nail the light greens, and perhaps depending on how much we want to put to it, the dark greens. The grays we probably don't have to do so much with, because even if we were to invest heavily in them, we're not really going to get much of a business result for you. So we can begin to tailor where we focus our effort to make sure that we don't try to consume everybody's time part of that is drilling down not just to the decisions that people make, like we showed in the previous chart, but actually the specific mistakes that they make in practice. So there's a phrase we call critical mistakes. There's an example shown on the field, shown on the screen at this point about an example critical mistake. What's helpful about getting down to the critical mistakes is, imagine if I ask you to train the job of, please train the skill of doing pilot training, pilot testing, and set you loose to do that. Well, that's a pretty unconstrained problem. But if I then come back and I say, by the way, if you can tackle the following 8 critical mistakes in pilot testing, you will gain 80% of the value for the business we could possibly gain. And an example of that is, making a mistake about which client department to go to because you only select the department that has the biggest adoption, failing to see that there's 3 other departments that add up to more money in total, and ignoring them. That's a common mistake. If I ask you to eliminate those 5 or 8 common mistakes in pilot testing, then all of a sudden your job becomes much more concrete. You're likely to have a much bigger impact when you actually go try to fix those things. You'll have a much more concrete skill to work on with your target audience. And that, again, helps you to focus down the solution, put the weight behind where the arrow really wants to be. So you're shooting at rifle shot targets, not shotgun targets. Now, the summary of that is focus on what matters by starting out with the business objectives, identifying the high-impact tasks, and identifying within those high-impact tasks the critical mistakes. And so that's really the third lesson. As we work on this with clients, the challenge we often get to this is, love the ideas and concept, and I know that, in fact, I ought to be spending more time generally on needs assessment than I should be. But the practicality of my day-to-day life is that we barely get time to do needs assessment, and what you're talking about sounds expensive and long. So we don't see being able to do that on all but perhaps the 1 or 2 projects that are really our key projects in any given year. And I think an interesting thing we've discovered is that actually doing this kind of assessment can become quick and affordable in many cases. And the reason for that is an idea about how to get the work done. Typically, any needs assessment process, you'll start out by understanding a little bit of the domain. You'll go and do a bunch of research to try to understand where the problems in the field actually lie. And then you'll come back and you'll choose some synthesis of that to pick your targets for where you want a solution, to what you want a solution to accomplish, and therefore how you want to structure that solution. And if you look at the cost of those 3 elements, it's 10% in the upfront work, it's 10% in the back end work. It's really going out to the field to get the data, which is where 80% of the cost lies. And what we found is that by shifting how you gather that data, you can make this process much more affordable. In particular, the typical approach to doing that needs assessment work is to go out and do shadowing and interviews. So really that sums to go to a few people and try to spend a fairly intensive amount of time with them to be able to gather data. And while that works and is quite effective, it's expensive. It takes a lot of staff time to be able to do that, not only from the participants, but also from the L&D team. And the alternative to that we've been using has been to, instead of trying to gather a lot of data from a few people, to try to gather a little bit of data from a lot of people, a crowdsourcing approach. And that's really by typically going out and reaching out through like survey technology to be able to winnow down to people who work directly with the target audience to say, which of these following tasks are the ones that have the biggest impact on the business result that we're after? Inside those tasks, what are the 3 most common critical mistakes that you see? And what we've seen is that by shifting to this survey-based crowdsourced approach, we're able to tap into the minds of 30, sometimes 50 individuals who have their pulse on actual behavior in the field. We're able to do that in only a couple days' time. The surveys can take, we've done the most recent one we did, took 8 business days to accomplish from the time we started to set up the survey to the time that we had finished gathering the data and started the analysis on it. They can be done very rapidly, and as such, they can be done very affordably. So what we're seeing here is that as we're trying to move towards demonstrating results, that clearly targeting for rifle shots rather than shotguns will improve our ability to do that. And in particular, by using a crowdsourced approach to our needs assessment, we can do a better needs assessment more quickly than we've been able to previously. So let me pause there. Those are our 3 ideas that we wanted to share. These ideas have come out of the work that we've done over the past year as we've tried to take seriously the notion that let's actually promise be accountable for results to our business partners, not simply providing some great training activities. And we hope that you found them interesting. I hope that you see opportunities to apply them inside your organization. What I'd like to do now is pause for a few minutes and see if we have a few questions. So we have a few minutes that are left for that.
Hey,
so
this is Tammy, and I thought I would just read to you some of the questions that have come through. And for those who are, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the question pod, and we'll answer them. So Tim was asking a few questions, which I believe I answered in chat for you, but Chip, I thought you could speak to it. Tim is asking about how the graphs are generated that you were showing and how learners are inputting the data. So I think a little bit more about the logistics of what you were showing today with M+.
Great. Yeah, so with that Management Plus solution, the graph that I showed was a graph that was for setting expectations. What's the behavioral assessment of what are the specific behaviors that mean that I'm setting expectations well versus not setting expectations well. So just a reminder to all about what the graph was about. The answer to how that graph is generated does come down to a technology support question. So as part of the Management Plus solution that we've seen, what we've done is we've implemented a portal to support the journey that a participant goes on with their manager. And inside that journey, at each step of the way, we gather the little bit of data that's generated by that step. So that engage step beforehand, I showed a little bit of a screenshot where Frank entered in his insights that he got from interviewing his team members, and that's entered into the portal. The way that portal behaves is that portal gathers a progress summary. So as Frank proceeds through his journey, he has what amounts to a report card that builds as he completes each step. So as he completes that first step in talking to his team, the insights that he entered, just a few sentences, show up in the report card. The next step is that he goes into the portal to conduct the behavioral assessment. And that is a technology that looks like SurveyMonkey. It's like a survey technology. It's an assessment. That's done in the portal. The advantage we have since we control that technology is then we can then control this next behavior. Which is once that's done, we're able to very nicely take the results of it, and we're able to share that immediately with Frank, but we're also able to publish it directly in his report card, so that when Frank goes back to remind himself where he is in the program, and his manager is preparing for a check-in conversation with, then they're able to both look at that progress summary independently, but also together when they're talking, and that progress summary will show that chart. And the chart is graphed by the Learning Portal as part of the solution. So great question. In Management Plus, since we have control over that technology portal, which is nice in order for being able to manage the whole journey, we can do this nicely integrated approach of putting it in a really easy to access way. Unless you have pretty high control over your learning technology, you may not be able to do that, in which case you begin to look for workarounds. Is there a third-party solution that I can do? One I think we're hoping for as the industry continues to mature is to be able to provide that integrated approach that we're able to with the Management Plus portal in more and more areas. I think that's a reusable technology. Good question.
And then lots of people have asked whether or not the webinar is being recorded, and indeed it is being recorded, and we will send out a follow-up email with information and access to links and things like that. So do stay tuned for that. Tim also commented that he found the journey metaphor to frame the training engaging in and of itself. So kind of shifting the language dip, and I know that that's something that you've thought about a lot, so you might want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think that metaphor of a journey is really, when we started down this path, it's been a while now, more than a year ago. I think, I think all of us in the learning space, know that we don't want to provide an event. We don't want to provide an intervention. We want to create change. And when we introspect, change takes time. Change is hard. And so, it's more than just an event. At the same time, so that idea of moving from an event towards a journey is really kind of the crux of what we've been talking about for the past hour. And, at the same time, historically, we in the learning space have felt hampered because when we know how to run events, we know we can get people to show up to them. We know that when they do show up and when they don't show up, we can control what happens within the four walls, and so we're able to have a level of fine-grained control over that. That as we begin to talk about the journey, we begin to feel slips away from us. How can we control what happens out there in the field when Frank goes back to work with Julia and tries to apply things on the job? And here is an area where I do think, just that last answer we talked about, the portal, comes into play. I think what we found over the past year is that being able to use technology to manage not only the complexity of the journey, there's 8 steps that Frank takes instead of 1 step of showing up to the half-day session, but not only manage those 8 steps, but also to be able to kind of pleasantly embed accountability into the journey. So the right people are responsible for the right things all of a sudden becomes very practical. So using that, again, coming back to the Management Plus example, we really want Frank and Julia to be the ones who are the nexus of taking responsibility for Frank coming up to speed and setting expectations, the participant and their manager. But in order to make that happen, we've never really been able to give Julia in particular the information and the data and the structure that she needs to do that efficiently if she's not one of those few managers who happens to be very naturally attuned to development, ready to invest in it, and good at doing it. Well, all of a sudden, by using the technology to break it down into concrete steps that everyone can see, we can see whether or not Frank actually has done his first step, because did he enter his 3 sentences about insights or not. Julia can then prep herself before she goes into the conversation by looking at what Frank has said. So, both Julia and Frank can see some of the questions that might be asked, and they can prepare for the conversation using a job aid. What we're able to do is begin to take that journey, which before, we've been nervous about as learning professionals, because we begin to lose control over it, and see how we can actually embody that accountability so we can get that control back and get people through the journey to a degree higher than we could have in years past without the wealth of technology we have in our hands. So that's really, I think that notion of journey is not only central, it's actually the ability of the technology we're able to bring to the table these days is a key supporting element. Well, we're coming up on time now. Kami, I don't know if there's a quick final question we'd like to address, or maybe we should wrap up to make sure that we don't overstay our welcome with the webinar.
Yeah, all good journeys must come to an end, and I think this might be the right time for that. Yeah, there's really a few more questions here and there, but we can follow up, and Chip has shared his email here on the screen, so if you have specific questions, please do share them with us.
Yeah, I'd love to hear your reactions, questions. My email's on the screen. If you have questions for me, if you have challenges for me, we will continue the journey of pursuing the journey, so I'd love to hear them. Also, if you'd like to learn a little bit more, on the left-hand side there's a link of an article that Kami and I worked on in Learning Solutions magazine, so you're welcome to follow the link and learn a little bit more detail about some of the ideas that we talked about today. Just like to say thanks for joining, and enjoy the rest of your day. Good luck as you pursue your own journeys. Bye-bye.